Karen Zabarsky, welcome to the Inquiring Mind Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Obviously we just got to talk for uh, a decent amount of time before. We had like a podcast before the podcast. So
We really did. Yeah.
one of the interesting things that I um, wanted to ask you is about entrepreneurship. Obviously, you decided to start a company of your own
Yeah.
during the pandemic. When did you first realize that you wanted to start your own company? And what led to that decision? What was that like? Not to quote Oprah, but like the aha moment uh, that
You
you
quote Oprah.
had.
Great. Mad respect for quoting Oprah. You know what? It's something that I've had the bug in me to want to do for a very long time, to go out on my own. And I was fortunate enough to be in a position working in commercial real estate that I was given, a lot of autonomy and almost like an entrepreneurial feel in terms of my job. I was running design and branding for a really big developer. And so just had a lot of kind of freedom in what I was doing. Then the pandemic hit, and I feel like such a post-COVID cliche for having these thoughts, but I guess a lot of people felt this way. I was one of the fortunate people of the pandemic that I experienced an extraordinary amount of freedom. Most people were not that lucky. I was very lucky to experience that. And I had, geographic freedom. I went home to Texas. I had kind of logistical and operational freedom of literally just how I wanted to run my day, when I wanted to work, when I wanted to go for walks, when I wanted to connect with family and friends, and when I wanted to work. And when I came back to reality of being in person and, being back in an office every day, it was incredibly difficult to go back to that and to have someone, just kind of in the normal, not in a bad way, but just kind of in the traditional way of doing things, like someone defining that for me. It was incredibly difficult. So I think that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And, on a more positive note, also, I was seeing that there were many people that felt this way, like I did, and many people who were starting their own projects or companies that were starting cool new endeavors or, construction projects that were finally breaking ground after 2 years of kind of a stalemate. And there's a real energy that I was feeling. And I said, you know what, this is the moment to strike and to try to go out on my own, see if I can make it.
Yeah. What do you think is the difference between the companies that decided, like the very prominent companies, like, I don't know, Facebook or Twitter, I think, that decided to almost go 100% remote and let their employees go remote? And then why are some industries or some businesses so hell-bent on not going remote and going to the office? What is it about the office that like
Uh,
is like a drug for some people?
I think you're spot on that it's definitely industry specific. It has very much to do with that. In real estate, you want to send the message that like, oh, everyone should be back in the office and paying rent and like, paying retail leases and, just kind of, it's a very in-person heavy industry, both in terms of tenants paying rent and also, construction projects. You can't build a building virtually. So I think all across the industry, people in real estate really wanted to send that message to the world of our team members are back in the office. We're here. We're ready to go. Everyone else should be also. And I haven't worked at like a big tech corporation, but I can only imagine that it's kind of a matter of competition. There are so many companies that were staying remote, and people in tech seem to be more on my side of like having that, fortune and luxury of having a flexible lifestyle during the pandemic. So What's interesting is that those same companies leased a lot of real estate during lockdown, even while they were telling their team members you can stay at home. You know, in New York City, Facebook leased something like 400,000 square feet. Google leased hundreds of thousands of square feet, because I think they saw where we're going today, which is that everyone's starting to come back.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting as to why. I remember during the pandemic, a lot of my friends and even myself were my friends were talking about, oh, I kind of wish I were in the office for this or for that. Um, I think the proximity to, say, your boss or your coworkers is the one enticing factor. Is like, you don't have to give them a call or you have to set up a Zoom call. You could just
Yeah.
stop by their, this might sound wrong, but cubicle or like their space,
Water cooler.
and be
Yes,
like, hey, I need help with this or that. But
totally.
instead of trying to reach them on the phone all the time, and they might be on the phone with someone else or whatever. So I think that's the one big thing. I think a lot of things I'm hearing now, um, is that people would love what you describe as freedom, like the flexibility option. So don't tell them to
Yes,
come to the office every single day. Give them the option to go to the office
yes,
twice a week, if they want to. And I think if you give
totally.
them the option, I think people actually would go, because they're like, um,
Yes,
and maybe that would kind of lead to my next point, where the productivity factor. I felt like some people were more productive at home. Again, this
yeah,
is very job dependent, but
yes,
there are a lot of distractions at home too. A lot of, if,
sure.
you know, uh, families that have kids, it's difficult to work when your kids are right there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, so I think going to the office is kind of like a mental and a physical escape from all of that. So
Yes.
how do we, like, I don't know how we're going to navigate this world going forward.
Yeah, you know what? I think there will be some kind of like a happy medium that's found where, I mean, I think most people share this at some point. It feels really dumb to just go into an office and sit by yourself and work at this point.
Yeah.
Like, at least for me, and you're right, it depends on everyone's individual situation, but it feels incredibly enriching to be able to go and meet with coworkers and have that FaceTime, literal FaceTime, and grow in your position and all of that. The way I've been thinking of it is that maybe offices will become kind of more like college campuses, as opposed to the more traditional, um, kind of go there for 8 hours a day or 12 hours a day and then just go home to sleep, where you do an enormous amount of your work either at home or in a second space, like in a coffee shop or wherever it might be. And then when you come for that in-person interaction, that sense of community, meeting with your mentors, that's why the college analogy kind of makes sense to me. Then you would come in person for that. But I also think that means that office design is going to be incredibly different going forward also.
And do you think the office spaces are going to be smaller because, um, again, I mean, some companies rent out like huge spaces
Yes.
for a lot of employees, but when you're either not going to have that many people in the office at the same time, or you just don't think that's like the best option, do you think that's going to affect commercial real estate in a negative way, where people are going to be renting very, like, much smaller spaces?
It might, I don't know if I would necessarily say that it would be smaller. And I think we're definitely seeing some big corporations that are taking enormous amounts of space. I think it's just going to be very different. I think there are going to be way more spaces. Obviously, a lot of companies like Google kind of already do this. But there are going to be way more spaces for like collaboration and recreation and like bonding and interaction, as opposed to these like walled off cubicles or even like glass offices where you just sit there and work by yourself. I think that's going to become extremely outdated use of an in-person office. And it'll be much more for that like interaction and FaceTime.
Yeah, I think the one thing I really liked about this sounds wrong, but one thing I liked that we learned from the pandemic is how much we actually need other people.
Yes.
And like when I think we were going closer and closer to a world where everyone thinks everything is going to be online, everything is over Zoom, or everyone talks via chats or video games or whatever. And it's kind of refreshing to me that when people saw each other again, how happy they were to see each other. Like I remember when I worked in real estate as well, when I went back to the office, certain people that might have never even spoken to you were like, "Oh my God, it's so nice to see you." And you know, and the thing is, I know they meant it because it was nice to see another human being smile, or their facial expressions, and um and I think that's such an important lesson that we learned in the last 2 years.
Oh my gosh, I could not agree with you more. And that's actually goes back to the point of why I think it's not necessarily going to be less square footage, but just different. Because there may also be a smaller square footage, maybe for like a singular company taking an entire floor. But I think we're also seeing an explosion of these like secondary spaces, these second spaces, as they're called, like, kind of clubs where you can get a small membership to, or these hybrid like food, co-working, community type of spaces. There's an explosion of those that are opening now. And so I think it's just that people want to experience their space and their time differently. In other words, if I work for Facebook, maybe I want to go into the office for 3 hours a day so I can, meet up with my mentor, I can meet with some of my employees and give feedback, whatever. But then I still want that human experience and those interactions, but with a different kind of community in a different type of space, with a more creative or like flexible environment. And that's where these second spaces are popping up.
Yeah.
So I think there will be just as much use of the real estate, but just in like much more kind of out of the box, flexible ways.
Yeah, I wonder how this is going to affect. This is a very practical, maybe, application, but um, like the healthcare industry. If a lot of people all of a sudden decide that they want to start their own thing, and one of the enticing things, and I know this keeps a lot of people in their jobs, is benefits, right? So whether that be a 401k, whether I think 401k not so much anymore because you can just take your money and invest it, but
All right. Yeah.
but the 401k is good for another reason. It's like it doesn't even give you the opportunity to use that money elsewhere.
For
So,
sure.
and then healthcare is the big one. So a lot of people don't leave their jobs because of healthcare. And
Yes.
I remember, I this is not going to be a political conversation, but one of the things I liked, Andrew Yang, who ran for mayor of New York
Yeah.
and for president, said something that I actually agree with. Tying healthcare to a job limits growth in a person's career, and
100%.
because people will end up staying in the job that they should have left like 3-4 years ago just because of healthcare.
Which is kind of insane, right? When you think
Yes.
about it.
So,
Totally.
so how do we deal with that? If, say, a lot of people now decide to take your route, right? Like where they start their own company, or a small business where they have a few employees. How do
Yeah.
they bring in the best talent without being able to provide that kind of healthcare or whatever service?
Maybe there will be some kind of a government or policy solution. I tend to imagine there's going to be some kind of a commercial capitalist solution that comes up, because I think many of the most creative solutions end up coming through in that way. But I have to tell you, since I've started my own company and I've met so many people who are freelancing, who are starting to have these more flexible situations, we all have so many of the same questions and concerns and problems that we need solutions to. An enormous one is healthcare. And, I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to afford like a market healthcare, but it's insanely expensive.
Right.
And it's also not great quality. So I feel confident that as this great reshuffling, people start like accept that we're here and that things are different, someone will come up with some kind of a solution of like, I think there needs to be some kind of a home base for people who are going into more flexible situations that definitely, surrounds healthcare, but also the legal aspect, the accounting aspect, the taxes, like all of these things, especially like the state by state tax is so outdated. Like right now I have clients across 5 different states, and I'm in New York and in Texas, and, the systems in place will be updated, no question about it.
Yeah. Um, so in 20 in April of last year, you wrote an article
Yes,
uh that I read and I really enjoyed. I think it was for 6 square feet. Is that where the article was?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's called Why Now is the Right Time to Move to New York City.
yes,
Um, I'm actually interested. I was reading it and I said, absolutely. The whole time I was like, yeah, this is the best time to move to New York City. And even though a lot of people around me were like, the city is dying, the normal regular thing people say.
yes,
But
yes.
it does kind of beg the question, why do people, if they have the flexibility, if they could do their job anywhere, why not move to, you know, Indiana or Texas, where, there's no state income tax and you can save a little bit more of your money. And
Yeah.
while in New York the taxes are pretty high, or in California the taxes are really high, why not move to a different state? What is it about New York that
Mm.
is always going to be like that have that magnetism to it? Will it always have this attraction to it?
Oh, I think it absolutely will. A big hero of mine who you had on your show, Ed Glazer, he talks a lot about how, cities that were built around one industry tend to die, whereas other cities that are built around ideas tend
Hmm.
to adapt and thrive in perpetuity.
Interesting.
And I think New York is certainly one of those cities where it's not built around one industry. It's based around the idea that people live in very close proximity to each other, sometimes too close. But there are all these serendipitous interactions and ideas and openness for experimentation. And so people come here again, not for an industry, not necessarily just for one job that they want to have forever. It's more about this incredible density of ideas and energy. And I actually think that, what we were all forced to do, which is to interact over Zoom over the past 2 years for so long, I think that has actually opened enormous doors in terms of what's going to happen in many ways, especially in real estate and design. But it also, kind of going back to your point, emphasizes that importance of being in person, of ideas and how they can grow from one person to another. And that it almost in a way made it even more important in terms of growth and ideas to be together. So I think a city like New York, it's an idea of cities. And so um, while, what I was talking about in that article, which was a bit of a protest article because everyone was writing, oh, New York is dead. New York is this, it's never going to come back. We can look outside now and see that's obviously not true. And it was very much just based on that idea that it was very much about entrepreneurs, especially, and how ideas are what can, breathe new life into a city. And you have to be in person for that.
Yeah, I think what really appealed to me about your article, I think I'm a romantic at heart, where I
Yes.
anytime I had that kind of feeling during the pandemic, I remember going to the city in like May of 2020 when the city was
Mhm.
in full lock, and me being the only person on the street, and I go, I don't think I've ever. It felt like Inception, almost like I'm like, this can't be
It felt
real.
like being on a movie set.
Yeah, I'm like,
I remember.
this is not real. Uh, but
Yes.
but what I found, uh, anytime I had the thought of being like, I'm gonna leave this city, like I'm gonna leave, I'm gonna go somewhere else because everyone is pissing me off, everything is pissing me off. I would I would take a walk. I had these like sanity strolls almost, where I'm like, uh,
Cities full. Yeah.
so I would just walk around New York, and I almost felt like I was falling back in love with New York all over again, and like the architecture, the even the loud noises at times. Like I have an ambulance in the background, and I'm like, it gets annoying when it's constant, but there's a rhythm and a beauty and a rhythm to this city that I can't.
A
If you have
heartbeat.
never been, it's so different than any place I've ever been. The only place, I mean, I haven't traveled all around the world yet. The only place that I found very similar in that feeling was Paris. Where in Paris,
Oh my God,
also like
couldn't agree more.
got that thing in my like, the butterfly.
In
Yeah,
here
and
somewhere.
here I'm like in here somewhere where I'm like, I was like, ooh, man, if I spoke French, I'd move here. Like this was
You could
uh
pull it off, Stanley.
I wish. But it was there's something there's something there. There's like a heartbeat. There's a grit to people. And in New
Yes.
York, what I realized during the pandemic, not to maybe to end my rant a little bit, but during the pandemic, a lot of people that could have left,
Yeah,
um, you know, to their second, third house or whatever. But the
right.
people that stayed were to me, embodied New York in the best way possible because they are the gritty ones. They're the ones that were like, I can't leave because my family's here, or financially I'm just not able
Yes,
to just pick up and leave. But
yes.
they kept working. They put their nose to the grindstone and they kept grinding away at it. And to me, that's what makes New York New York. Like you see all of these people walking down the street. We as New Yorkers, we forget that they're all individual human beings with individual stories because just so many damn people. Um,
A lot of
but
people.
yeah, but they have struggles and they have something to their lives that makes them unique, and
Yes.
that adds to the fabric of New York.
I think that's what's I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that what I was feeling, especially around then, like April 2021, was especially seeing the innovation and the courage of entrepreneurs,
Mm,
especially who, I mean, entrepreneurs inherently have to have a kind of insane optimism, in general, but especially during the pandemic, just seeing regular New Yorkers who maybe, had a job previously or had a company previously that completely came crashing and burning down with the pandemic. And, my friend's A5 studio who did office fabrication, overnight, all 15 of their jobs were done, completely closed off. So they thought about it, they researched for a while, and they decided to pivot into making work from home desks in their warehouse in Brooklyn. I have a friend who owns a signage company for hotels. They do like signage for hotels. Overnight, all of his business
right.
was totally done. So he decided to pivot and make these signs for healthcare workers. And for his company, he started producing those, please stand 6 feet apart
Nice.
vinyl for floors and things like that. And, that's really true of entrepreneurs anywhere, but especially in New York when it was so tough and so dark. And then to see those elements of light kind of shining through, I think was incredibly special. But, what I would say is that I do think there's also something nice about the fact that these other urban cores across the US have become like viable in their own ways. Whereas before the pandemic, nothing could compare to New York. Nothing could compare. And maybe it still can't. But There's some of these cores, Miami, that's like so focused on crypto now. Austin, that's so focused on tech and culture also, and kind of flourishing in that way. All Salt Lake City, Oklahoma City, all of these cities that are now starting to become like really viable urban cores, viable in terms of, economic growth and career growth, I think is really special outcome of, this very dark time. And I think it also in a way like restored a bit of balance in New York, which in a way, I think so much of what makes New York amazing, like that creativity and the grassroots endeavors, have been priced out
Yeah.
basically before the pandemic. And somehow this rebalancing, I think rents are climbing up more and more again, but they, at least for a period, really restored the balance in terms of bringing down the rents and creating a little more affordability and allowing people who, are like the lifeblood of what makes New York incredible, be able to afford to be here, or like be in Manhattan for the first time, or be in Williamsburg for the first time, or wherever. So I think the fact that those nodes have spread out to a few other cities, I think is a really interesting change too.
Yeah, one of the things we brought up earlier was this idea of freedom. So when people start a business, I think a lot of people have this misconception about starting business, and it is very stressful, I would imagine, right? It's stressful. It's um, a lot of hours you're putting into it, but it's your thing that you're putting into. But
Yeah,
oddly enough, I would imagine that gives you this feeling of a sense of freedom that you get from
sure.
running your own business and running at your own time.
Yes.
Um, what what do you think was like the biggest change that you had from working in a formal job environment to starting your own company? What was the biggest one aspect that was like, oh, this is like completely different?
Oh my gosh, so many aspects, such a great question, but I would say the most poignant and kind of like life-changing difference was the ability to choose the projects that I was working on.
Hmm.
And obviously, the ability to choose is only in terms of whoever wants to hire me. So it's not ultimate freedom. But even working in a corporate environment, I was always very, and I was working on 1,500 unit master plans on these huge projects. But my favorite thing was always like the small space that I turned into like a rotating art gallery, and like the local community loved it, or just these like smaller but like very impactful community oriented spaces. And that was always my favorite part of my job, which wasn't actually part of my job. I just made it a part of my job.
Mhm.
And so, being out on my own and just being able to say, okay, I'm going to take on this project, I'm going to take this on, but I'm actually going to pass on this project so that I can do a project like, what's next door to you, Silicon Harlem, which was such an incredibly meaningful project. And, maybe in a corporate environment, wouldn't have necessarily been kind of in line with the business goals or whatever. But it was an incredible opportunity with an incredible founder and an incredible mission. And the ability to be the captain of my own ship of my time and decide, okay, I'm able to cover the rent this month. So, we're going to work on these projects and be able to move things around, is incredibly empowering.
So maybe a two-part question uh, that I'll ask next is your company, GroundUp. Um, can you describe to people what the company is all about? And then you kind of you started talking about one of your projects, which is Silicon Harlem, literally 2 blocks away from my house. But can you explain what your company does and what you did for a company like Silicon Harlem? What kind of service you provide?
Yes. GroundUp is a multidisciplinary creative studio for the built environment, which means that it's basically the creative aspect of any project A to Z that relates in some way to real estate, architecture, prop tech. And so we do strategy, we do design, we do branding, communications. But I think the way that I would really describe that kind of from my heart is that when I was working in real estate, that's how I always approached any project, like with a very holistic view. And that's, I think many industries are like that, but in real estate, it's a pretty progressive view of a project. I think traditionally there's kind of the real estate developer that does development, acquisitions, management. Then there's the architecture firm. They do the drawings, like really at the behest of the client. Like they try to get their ideas in there, but it's really at the end of the day, the ownership decision. And then, maybe if they're lucky at the end of the day, they bring on a branding agency to like put a name over the door. And I was fortunate enough to be in the position of taking a very different approach to the projects I oversaw, which was to kind of combine all of that into more of a storytelling perspective. And to be able to say at the very beginning of an acquisition, okay, we acquired this piece of land. What's the story here? Like, what's the city? What's the context? What's the community? What's needed here? What's not needed here? What's like the heart and soul of this neighborhood? And then to be able off the bat to kind of tell the story and have that inform every decision going forward was, the kind of the model that I created when I was in-house. And it's exactly the model that I'm bringing forward with GroundUp now to every project. So Silicon Harlem is a great example of that. It was actually an incredibly, as we would say in Yiddish, beschert experience. It was really meant to be because I announced GroundUp on January 10th. And on January 9th, I got this email from this guy named Clayton Banks, and he said, hey, we have some mutual contacts. I have a renovation. Do you know someone who could help with that? And I said, well, I'm starting a design studio tomorrow. So I'll do it. I'll do with it. And I went in to meet him literally the next day. And anyway, he's the founder of this incredible organization called Silicon Harlem. And their mantra is everyone needs a connection. And the founder says that all the time, everyone needs a connection. And what he means by that is so many different things. They provide broadband for vulnerable populations. And especially in Harlem, which I wasn't aware of this, 40% of residents don't have access to broadband. So that's an enormous focus of theirs. And then also in a more abstract way, creating connectivity by they bring people together in their space for events. They have after school programs for kids, in specifically like connecting them with new technologies and teaching them about that. And then they also amazingly connect people from like government, universities, huge tech corporations, and the local neighborhoods and bring them all together for conversation. They're absolutely incredible. They've been doing that for more than 10 years. And so this wonderful man, Clayton, he brought on GroundUp to basically lead design of renovating their entire 3,000 square foot space, which was totally white box, into an innovation hub. And we had to kind of define together what that meant, although he had a really big vision for it. And I think what was so cool about this project which really ties into kind of the beginning of our conversation, is that when I started this project, I was really a solopreneur. I was really kind of a one-woman shop. And although I continue to be the only full-time employee, I began to create this model, which I've repeated 3 to 4 times since completing Silicon Harlem, of creating these highly expert kind of design clusters for each project that, you know, have these kind of sharpshooters in whatever their area is. It's specifically tailored to that project, like whoever the team members are that we bring on for that project. But it's also amazing because these aren't full-time employees. They all have their own like amazing post-pandemic flexible situations in all kinds of different ways. And so I'm able to bring on these very expert people, but without having the overhead or, you know, the stress of having, you know, 10 six-figure salaries, like throughout every single project. So that was kind of my first time pulling that off, and I found it's incredibly successful.
Where did you get this business model idea from?
It was very organic
Oh,
at first.
mhm.
I mean, you know, I obviously like hiring freelancers is nothing new, but I think what is new is, you know, I think even just to describe a few of the people who ended up coming onto this project. And, you know, to back it up, I basically just kind of put out a call on LinkedIn, on my social media, asking through friends. I'm looking for an architect. I'm looking for someone who can do this. I'm looking for someone who can do that, to kind of put my team together. And a bunch of people responded. A bunch of people were referred to me. So, like, to give you an example of a few examples of my team members, I had one woman, Stephanie Silverman, who just started her own design studio. She's an architect. It's called IASIS Labs. And she came post-pandemic, came up with a flexible situation with her boss where they reduced her salary. She works for them full-time 3 days a week with full benefits. And the other 2 days of the week, she's allowed to just focus on building her own company. And, you know, I think that was something that pre-pandemic would have been like unimaginable.
Right.
And so she helped me with my like official drawings for the project. I had another woman who was a creative executive at Bedrock Detroit, which is Dan Gilbert's real estate company, incredible development company. And during the pandemic, she had a baby. She wanted to move back home to Boston. She just decided that that life wasn't for her anymore. And so she wanted a more flexible kind of freelance lifestyle. So with her, she was incredibly talented. She was exactly what we needed for that project. And she worked, you know, some days from 8 to 10 a.m., took care of her family during the day, and then worked again from 10 p.m. to midnight. Or, you know, worked all day one day and then 0% the next day. And she was incredibly efficient, incredibly productive and engaged. But she had that flexibility in her life. And you know, every other person who was a member of the team had their own unique, flexible setup. And so was able to participate in this kind of flexible design cluster situation. And I just found that it was incredibly beneficial, you know, for the project, because all of these incredibly highly talented people were working on it. And, you know, this woman, Jess, for example, who did our spatial graphics, she was perfect for this project. For my next project, I needed something that was more kind of flowy and artistic, like watercolor vibe. She wouldn't have been perfect for that.
Right.
So, you know, you can just imagine the difficulty of having all of these people on full time, as opposed to just being able to build these kind of flexible creative clusters for each project. It's incredibly beneficial.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I think that applies to pretty much every company, right? Sometimes you have a person in your company that's really good at job X. But when it
Yes.
comes to like X with a tweak, right, or something a little more unique in that whatever project they're working on, that person would not be the best choice for that particular project. So you can't, as a company, you can't go, I'm going to hire somebody else just for this project, because you already have a guy. So you feel like you're using that person for something that they're probably not supposed to be used for. And I think that's a very interesting model. What I really like that you said earlier was when you were talking about Silicon Harlem, you said that uh, every place you ever design, or you think about how they should be designed, you think about the neighborhood, the people, the like you don't
Yes.
I think there's definitely like a tendency for people that build buildings that kind of ignore the history of a neighborhood, and they just plop a
Yes.
building in the middle of something and be like, it works. But um
Yes.
the one example that the first time I was like really inspired by to kind of maybe start my own thing during the pandemic was there was a Wall Street Journal article
Mm.
um about this woman. I want to say Leia is her name. She worked for Strand Bookstore, which is in Union Square. She was like their
Yeah,
marketing
yeah,
person. She ended up leaving, or whatever happened. I might be getting all these details wrong. And she
yeah.
started her own bookstore um in like
Amazing.
I think it's China, like around Chinatown.
Oh,
I've been there a few times, and she sells books, like used books and pickles. Uh, and I was like, a very interesting combination. Kind of the branding around it is really fun, and makes you want to go. It's like a pretty small space, but great
oh,
bookstore.
I love that so much.
Some really great bargains in that bookstore as well. But then I found out the reason she sold pickles is because back in the day, like that neighborhood was known for selling pickles as like street food. I was
Oh my
like,
God.
that is
Amazing.
ingenious.
Genius.
Uh,
Genius.
so I think it's so important to know what a neighborhood values, not just to impose your values on a neighborhood. And I think I I once worked in a company, and I worked around a lot of like urban planning students or urban planners. And
Yeah.
one guy who lives in India now, but he said urban planners have a tendency to want to play God, where
Sure.
they think we know best, and we're gonna tell you
Very prescriptive.
yeah,
Yeah.
prescriptive, instead of telling them specifically, like, here are a few recommendations, but based on your history, based on your story. And I think that's what's incredible about what you told me and what you do, is that you have to do a lot of kind of you have to do a lot of homework in figuring out what is the history of this neighborhood, what do people value, because and kind of stepping outside of yourself and not saying here's what you should be doing,
Yeah.
because everyone has a different perspective in that regard.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I feel like I have had the experience of going about that, having that, like doing that in a really wrong way earlier in my career, and learning from that and doing it in the right way. It's been a huge lesson for me, by which I mean, there's a project that I worked on for 5 years. I was the co-founder of, called The Tanks at Bushwick
Mhm.
Inlet Park. And I and my co-founder, we found these like abandoned, decommissioned oil tanks on the Williamsburg waterfront. And we were like, oh my God, these are so insanely cool. Like, someone should turn these into a park. And through our research, we saw that cities all over the world had started doing this. So we were like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to love this.
Mhm.
They didn't. Well, I would say like 90% of them did, like the Williamsburg community, they loved it, they embraced it. And then there was this 10% of the community, longstanding members of the community, who didn't think, adaptive reuse of oil tanks was very cool. They actually had like very painful and traumatic memories associated with these tanks. And like what, even though they were totally decommissioned, like nothing to do with
Yeah.
current health conditions, but they had horrible memories and they had horrible associations and, stories from their parents and kids and what had happened. And they saw it as a huge scar on the community. And we really, when we started out, we were really young. We didn't realize that there was that pain associated with them. And that was a huge lesson for us, huge, huge lesson in terms of like, you might think that it's the coolest thing in the world, but, or in the case of developers, like you were saying, like, oh, you might think it'll make a lot of money, maybe it will, but there's that empathy that's so necessary in terms of understanding the historical context and the current context and the health context and the ecological context. And so I really learned a lot of lessons from that. And later I had a different project called Bung Lounge, which was this empty retail space in Long Branch, New Jersey. And I think the ownership was thinking about just kind of filling it with another retail shop. And I had been really inundated in the community and just like talking to them and listening to what they need. And it turned out that there were an enormous amount of artists in the community and zero white walls to put up their art. Like they had a little wall in the library that the library gave them, and sometimes they could put it up there. So I pitched the ownership of this building to transform it into a local art gallery. And the reception was unbelievable. I mean, it couldn't have been more opposite from the process of like the initial process of the tanks, which also evolved. But it was very rooted in like what the community actually needed and wanted.
Yeah.
And because of that, they were very accepting, not just of the space, but of the larger development around it, because it felt like it was attuned to, their culture and their needs. So the point being that it's not just like the right and empathetic thing to do. It can also be like the commercially viable thing to do,
Right.
because the community feels like it's incorporated, it's integrated, and it's much more kind of ingrained in the fabric of the community.
Yeah. I think that's also that story and that comparison is very powerful for a person that's looking to start their own business.
Mm,
When you start your own business, I think you have this, again, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but a lot of people do think they probably know best, and they are afraid of maybe making a mistake. And I think making mistakes could sometimes, actually most of the time, if you take it the right way, can teach you a thing or two and then lead you to correct in the future and know to avoid certain things in the future, or to pay attention to something else. Um, and failure is, I think, so important. I think um, I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and I was like, we were actually playing. There's this, like a card game or whatever, and there's a question in the card game. There was like, are you more afraid of success or failure? And
mm,
it's interesting. Everyone answered failure. I answered success, because I was like, I think I've had enough failure in a short amount of time where I'm like, I screw up in different things, and I didn't do, not that I didn't try, but I think it was more of just, I felt like I messed up enough times where I was like, I am not afraid of it, because it's just
right.
a way to keep growing. And I'd rather make that mistake than live kind of uh, in this like gray zone of just being hesitant all the time. I'd rather make the mistakes and get it out of the way. Um, so
100%.
I think that's so important. One of the things I love that you shared on LinkedIn was about helping entrepreneurs, and there's a 3-step almost prescription to how people could help entrepreneurs. And I'm gonna kind of read them out. One of them is connect them with the right people.
Mhm.
The second is gift them subscriptions to different services, or to different um, I'm trying to give it like I guess like memberships or classes or whatever that might help benefit their business
Platforms, yeah.
platforms. Yeah. And then sharing their work or content.
Mhm.
So connecting, let's start with the first thing, connecting with the right people. Um, who do you think, you don't have to name them by name if you don't want to, but like maybe one or two people that kind of shaped who you ended up being and how you,
Mm.
without those connections, you wouldn't be in the place that you are today?
Oh my gosh. Well, that is an amazing question, but I'll also just tell you, like, in terms of that list, um, it's interesting because I think, especially for women, maybe for everyone, but people tend to celebrate like birthdays and wedding anniversaries and, oh, you got engaged. But when you start a company, there isn't really that sense all the time necessarily of like celebration and support and like, you can do this, maybe just from your mom, but like from kind of the broader community, the way they
Huh.
rally around um, more personal things, or like other life events.
Very interesting.
And so I think people, that's why I kind of felt like I wanted to put that out there, because um, people don't, I think it's somehow, it's like not a part of our culture yet to like really support and embrace and celebrate people who are going out on their own. So I think that's like, an interesting conversation to have in general. But that's such an excellent question. I think I would say the person who, one of the people who has shaped me the most recently, I would say, is my friend Frida. She also left her job during the pandemic and to start her own endeavor. And this kind of goes back to my explanation of the original post, because I have a lot of calls with a lot of girlfriends where we talk about breakups and things like that.
Mm.
Frida is not like that. Frida and I, like almost immediately starting in lockdown, we would get on the phone every week and we would talk about business. And we would talk about, how's your job going? How's your job going? This is really frustrating. How do I deal with this? And it actually ended up being an enormous source of support.
Yeah.
And I think for both of us, and to the point that now we talk 2 times a week. We have 2 hours a week that we talk, and she tells me what's happening with her clients and vice versa, and we work through things together. And in fact, it was so helpful that we decided to form this thing called the Great Breakfast Club. You're invited now, Stanley, if you'd like to join. That we made kind of in response to the Great Resignation, and or the Great Reshuffling, or whatever you want to call it. And so we now have like a weekly call where, like 10 to 20 of our friends who are all on this like great reshuffling boat just dial in. And this is why I'm so confident there's going to be some kind of a commercial solution to these.
Right.
Everyone has the same issues. Everyone has the same questions. My taxes, my health insurance, my this, that, what do we do? But really none of that would have happened without Frida.
That's awesome. I think I read a book. It's a very short book. Oh God, I want to say Show Your Work. Wait, no, whatever.
Something
This
like
guy
that.
Austin Kleon, Kleon, I think that's how you pronounce his name. God, I'm like really messing this up today. But he wrote this book, and one of the things he wrote in the book is um credit the, like, if you take a piece of an idea or a piece of content from somebody, make sure you always credit them,
Hmm.
because that's so important. I actually never, I mean, I always give credit where credit is due, but I think
Yeah,
I never thought about it that way. And I know a lot of people that would probably take a quote and not say who the quote is by, and it makes
right.
them, you know, they could be quoting Shakespeare, and they're literally, people won't know that until they're like, wait. is that your quote? That's pretty genius. So, so, but all in all, I'm trying to say that sharing people's work and people's content is so important.
Mhm.
And it goes a long way. I think, especially, and I'm not talking about some like karma or whatever. I'm talking more about if you, I really do believe that if you're kind to people or like you give your time, which is the most precious thing you can give people,
Yes,
um,
absolutely.
it will come back to be like a positive somehow in your life. Like that person might end up becoming very successful, and then they'll remember what you did for them that, a long time ago. I always talk about like my first guest on my podcast was an oncologist. Well, her name is Dr. Azra Raza at Columbia University, and
Mm,
she wrote a really good book called The First Cell about catching cancer early. And I went to a talk of hers when I was still in college at the Asia Society, which is by on like 69th Street or something like that in Manhattan.
mhm.
And she was talking to this very prominent oncologist named Siddhartha Mukherjee, who writes about cancer. I'm a little bit of a nerd. So
I love it. Yeah.
so I went to the talk, and in the book she wrote like, um, email me your thoughts when you read the book. And I did read the book. I never actually emailed her thoughts. And then I think a year or so, or maybe 2 years after the book came out, I started the podcast, and I was like, you know what? I think this would be the best person to reach out to. And there was like a fear of reaching out. And I reached out, and she ended up doing the podcast and being my first guest.
Incredible.
So I think it's so important to, you know, take that time and talk to people, and not just say things and not be able to back it up with action. Um, I
Yes.
know, I know it's it's, we all have our lives, so I'm gonna try to wrap this up real quick. Um, I have two questions I ask
Yes.
everyone. The
Oh.
first question is, what gives you hope for the future?
Mhm.
I asked everyone. I asked Jordan as well. And then the second question is, what are 5 books that you would recommend to people, fiction or nonfiction?
Oh my gosh. What gives me hope? Um, the first thing that comes to my mind is cities, actually. I think cities have, and we're seeing this now more than ever, an incredible capacity for rebirth
Yeah.
and for reinvention. And if you and I are both sitting in New York City right now, and I can look outside and see what I'm seeing after what this city has just been through, just through sheer kind of will and creativity and strength, that gives me incredible hope for the future.
Mhm.
Um, and 5 books.
So the 5 books I ask everyone,
Okay.
regardless, but I saw, I think on your Instagram, I saw uh a lamp that you had, a really cool, I think it was, yeah, it was like you had like a cool lamp, and there are like books underneath. So I was like, I think you won't have a problem answering this
I'm
question.
a big reader. So no, I'm more thinking like, oh my gosh, what do I talk about first? I would say number one, Sapiens. I know
Mm.
that's like kind of a cliche book, but it truly changed the way that I see the world. Um, Educated, another book that completely changed how I see the world. Um, Atlas Shrugged. Maybe I could put Atlas Shrugged / Fountainhead under the same number 3. But Atlas Shrugged, especially considering the climate we're in today, I think should be required reading for everyone. Let's see, I'm like looking over here on my bookshelf. Um, I would also say, incredible book called If Mayors Ruled the World. One of my all-time, If
Mayors.
Mayors Ruled the World, which I love because I believe mayors should rule the world. I think it's like the most effective elected position.
Not oh, I actually want to not press you, but like ask a question about that. Not governors.
Governors also, but I think mayors are like one of the only positions that can have incredible impact and also know their constituency by name and like by face and by name, many
Interesting.
of
Interesting.
it's like a level of incredible intimacy with their citizens,
Yeah.
but also having, as opposed to council members or things like that, having the power to really make sweeping changes. So I am a huge fangirl of mayors around the world. It's one of my, it also is a position that has such capacity to inspire other cities around the world,
Oh, sure.
to say, oh, this is how we worked on homelessness in our city. This is how we worked on a water shortage. This is how we worked
Right.
on this, that other cities around the world can be inspired by. So I love mayors.
That's interesting. I've never read that book, but I'll check it out.
Oh, it's incredible. And then just for fun, I would throw in an incredible book called Carry On Comfort, which is like an 80s horror sci-fi crazy book, but it's absolutely amazing. It's one of my favorites of all time.
Awesome. This was a blast. I hope we could do it again.
Yeah, this was so fun.
Yeah, thank you for taking a decent chunk of your time to talk to me.
For having
Well,
me.
yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Stanley.